Hello, everybody. This is the April 3rd presentation of the IPNSIG Academy talk on chasing peaceful innovation, exploring intersections between technical, internet, and lunar governance, a talk by Jacob Malthouse of the Open Lunar Foundation. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Malthouse. His background begins with being at the United Nations Environment Program as project manager for the Finance Initiative. Then he was at ICANN, the nonprofit that's responsible for critical aspects of technical internet governance, where he developed and launched the ICANN Fellowships Program and was a founding member of the ICANN Global Partnerships team. He then worked on the .eco, top-level domain registry, for many years. Then he took on ecosystem strategy for a Canadian company, Foresight, that works on clean technology, and is now executive director of the Open Lunar Foundation, which is going to be, which is dedicated to ensuring a sustainable future for lunar exploration and development. We will now hear a little bit about what that means, and I will stop sharing so that Jacob can begin. One moment.
Thanks very much, Scott. I'll just pull up my screen here. And hopefully be able to go into slideshow mode without breaking anything. Okay, how's that, Scott?
Looks good to me.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much, Scott, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to IPNSIG for creating this opportunity for us to talk about our work at Open Lunar and to talk about a subject that I'm extremely passionate about. I've been working on global governance and policy for my whole career, almost 24 years now, in sustainability and internet governance, and now in space. And there are tremendous complementarities that I hope to touch on here and hopefully get you thinking about other ones that I haven't thought of, because I do feel that the space sector is in need of an expanded idea space for how we engage and involve policy, engineering, technical, cultural leadership in how we expand our knowledge and interaction with the universe. So it's a very exciting time to be doing that work. And without further ado, I'll move on with my presentation here. I'm going to start by just giving a bit of background around Open Lunar, because it's quite a fascinating organization that I think also has many parallels with the work of IPNSIG and is grounded in a similar origin story. And then I'll move into some sort of nuggets that I've picked up over the years, both at Internet Governance and now working at Open Lunar, that I think might get people thinking about complementarities. So Open Lunar was founded not too long ago in 2018. It's an independent nonprofit that was set up to ensure a peaceful and sustainable lunar future. And it came from something called the Low Cost Lunar Settlement Workshop, which you can Google. It was a really interesting meeting that involved getting together some visionaries between space, technical expertise, government, and business to think about how we could do the moon more efficiently, more cheaply, and do it for the long term. And it was bringing in these ideas of, hey, we can use open collaboration tools to create the internet. Could we bring more of that into space? And what would that look like? And would it have these knock-on effects of creating a more peaceful and sustainable lunar future? Because the risk is, frankly, the risk is war on the moon. The risk is that we have a conflict in space that sets space exploration back a generation or generations. And if there's one thing I think the internet has taught us, is that it is possible for people to work together even when they are adversarial or competitive in other areas. So I just want to hover on the incredible leadership of Open Lunar. We're chaired by Commander Chris Hatfield, who's a former ISS commander. We have some incredible technical expertise with Lindy Elkins-Tanton, Robbie Shingler, and Jesse Kate Shingler. And we have two incoming directors, Carlos, the former president of Costa Rica, Will Pomerantz, who's the founder of an incredible space-oriented fellowships program, and of course, Tanya Masson-Zwan, who is a leading international space law and policy expert. So you can see in this board of directors how we're trying to embody a cross-pollination between STEM and geopolitical policy leadership to be creative in how we come up with new ideas for lunar sustainability. So how do we do that? We're not just a think tank. So we actually develop leaders and ideas through a project development process to create examples. So real world institutions that inspire optimism. So it's not enough to just come out with a report for us. We actually want to create bedrock. So that could be a technical standard. It could be a new company. It could be a new nonprofit. It could be a new event or collaboration that didn't exist before. It could be even a mission, flying a mission. So all those things are on the table for us as long as they contribute to this lasting impact goal. I want to talk a little bit about our process here. This is one of those complex slides with lots of words and lots of boxes, but I'll just talk through it and try and simplify it. Essentially, we're starting with ideas, and ideas are akin, I think, in some ways to a request for comment or an RFC. It's like, I have an idea for how I think we could do this better. And by this, I mean peaceful and sustainable lunar settlement. And we actually have a group of subject matter experts. So we have a group of affiliates now, about 20 of them, as well as our board of directors, that coalesce around these ideas once a year. And we actually go through and rank them. And the top ideas turn into projects. So these are fellowship projects. They're 8-month research projects. You can come from anywhere in the world at any stage of your career. So just a caveat, it does have to be a country that can work with the United States. And there are a few countries that can't right now, unfortunately. But most countries can. And you're working for 1 day a week, you're coached, you have support from the subject matter experts to come up with a solution to this idea and build it out. Then we go into an evaluation, and some of those projects actually get shortlisted for additional development as grantee projects. So that could be a multi-year, like 3 to 5 year effort to try and create and implement and execute that idea through to self-sustainment. And that means that it basically is a project that no longer requires Open Lunar support. So there's lots of examples like this in the corporate sector, in corporate innovation labs that spool up companies and then spin them out. We're applying some of that rubric to this model, but we're not just creating companies. We're creating quite a wide array of solutions that can contribute to our goal. So you heard me talk in the last slide a little bit about that prioritization process. And I wanted to just touch on that here because this is in many ways our special sauce. These metrics are the filters that we use to discern what is an idea that's worth investing in. This is really version 1 of this. So we first ran this filter last year, and we're going to run it again for a second time this year. And we may simplify and combine or add new filters over time. But you can see that, for example, contribution to governance, contributions to commons management capacity, those are criteria that you could argue draw on the multi-stakeholder model, MSMs, and the way that technical internet governance happens. And we've done that quite purposefully because we want to integrate these types of concepts into how space infrastructure is built and sustained. There are other things in here as well. Cooperation and conflict reduction, contributions to sustainability, obviously spot on for our mission. The last 3 criteria are what I would call sort of brass tacks criteria. So it's things like, are other people doing this, right? Is the private sector just going to do it? Because if they are, then we don't really need to do it. Is it the right time? Are we doing something that isn't going to be relevant in 10 years, or is it relevant now? And does it address a market failure? So again, it's sort of this idea of like, are we stepping into a space that otherwise wouldn't be stepped into? And that does require some courage, and I'm proud of the courage of the research that we do. So here's a long list of past projects. I'm not going to read them all off, but I want to tick on a couple that I think might be interesting for people if you're interested in understanding a little bit more about what's behind what we do. Res Luna analyzed governance approaches from Earth systems to draw insights to their applicability to lunar resource systems. That was a really interesting project. The Lunar Policy Handbook, second from the bottom there, is really worth checking out as a baseline reference guide to understanding the state of play for lunar policy currently. And I'll just touch on some of our ongoing projects here. There's a couple here that are relevant that I'll talk a bit more later. Designing a registry of lunar objects and activities, investigating the standardization of power provisions for lunar missions, also establishing a transparent payload review mechanism for lunar missions inspired by systems like ICANN and the FAA. So those are three kind of concrete examples where we are weaving in multi-stakeholder model approaches to solutions that could be applied to peaceful and sustainable lunar futures. And if you're interested in learning more about these projects, you can reach out to me directly, and I can connect you into the fellows that are leading this work. So that's an update on Open Lunar, and I hope it gives you a little snapshot for the work that we do. Now I'm going to move into exploring multi-stakeholder models in the lunar context. This is the bit where I get to get creative and hopefully not too controversial, but maybe a little bit. It's really an incredible time to be involved in lunar policy. When I first heard about the opportunity to work at Open Lunar and started to dig deeper and understand what's happening in this landscape, what's happening in this sector, I was blown away by the potential that's going to happen in the next decade, next 20 years. There's a couple of things that are happening, but one of the top line numbers is over 100 missions planned in the next decade. And most people, I think, aren't aware of the scale and pace at which lunar missions are accelerating towards this idea of sustained human presence. I've often used the analogy that reminds me of where the internet was at kind of in the 70s, kind of before that commercialization really happened under the Clinton administration, and in the or I guess that was now in the 90s, but that commercialization happened and it just resulted in an explosion. And we're just at the cusp of that in the space sector right now, where we're moving from this kind of technical government dominated world to one in which private sector, civil society are much more engaged. And here's some of the examples, increasing mission frequency and decreasing mission costs. So especially as SpaceX ramps up its capacity, we're going to see huge decreases in the cost per kilogram to get things into orbit. And it's just going to completely change how we think about work in space because of those decreasing costs. My chair, Chris Hadfield, is fond of saying that it's going to cost 25 times less to get a kilogram into orbit than it did when they were constructing the ISS. So a massive change. You're also seeing multiple actors from different jurisdictions, right? So the pictures on this side here, I have on the top, the recent Intuitive Machines lander, which is a private sector US actor, the JAXA SLIM lander, which is a Japanese lander in the middle, and at the bottom, the Chandrayaan-5 rover, all in the last 18 months doing lunar landings. And so what that's doing is it's putting, older governance regimes under stress. So the Outer Space Treaty is a 1973 treaty. It has some very lofty clauses in it about how no one can own anything on the moon. There can't be any weapons in space. It's very aspirational as a treaty. And it hasn't really been tested in the context of sustained presence on another planet. And so that's going to create a lot of tension and a lot of opportunity for us to think creatively about how we work in a lunar context together. We've also seen the emergence of new regimes, I think, designed to kind of bridge between the OST and actual actions planned or occurring on the lunar surface. And the Artemis Accords are an example of that. So the Artemis Accords are a framework for collaboration that countries can sign up to work with NASA on its Moon to Mars program. And ILRS is the Chinese answer answer is maybe the wrong word. It is the Chinese comparison to or partner to Artemis, in which countries can sign up to work on the Chinese lunar program. So we're seeing emergent exploration of best practices and ways of coordinating. It's creating a really fruitful ground, a lot of speculation, but still early stage, not a lot of testing yet. And that's creating opportunities for evolving roles for science, industry, and civil society. So now is a really good time for technical experts to be informing policy experts and vice versa about how the fast-moving technology is going to influence policy frameworks. What are the risks? How do we manage those risks without stifling innovation? All those challenges have been faced before in the creation and development of the internet. So I think one of the things, I've talked about this first one, I'll just add that I do think we see private sector lowering costs, but government research is still really driving innovation. Space is still really dominated by government actors, and markets are sustained only because of government funding. If government funding, apart, I think, from LEO, but low Earth orbit, but in lunar, 100%, like if government were to cancel lunar programs, there would be no lunar commercial sector. That's my view at this point. That could change in the coming decades, but at the current point, it's really dependent on incubation from governments. And so what that means is that government thinking is really dominating strategy here. Now, NASA's CLPS program, Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, is, I think, a great example of how NASA is acknowledging that and trying to bring in private sector creativity to that process, and it creates an opportunity for us to think more about how we work across sectors. I do know that the ICANN model was discussed in the context of recent decisions around low Earth orbit regulation in the US context. So thinking about how we regulate LEO, Department of Commerce and FAA have recently kind of clarified their roles in regard to how they manage LEO. And I do think there's still an opportunity to think about multi-stakeholder models in this regime because it's still quite young. But thus far, we haven't really seen, I think, an assertive approach to adopting MSMs, multi-stakeholder models in space. And I think that's honestly a bit of a missed opportunity. I think we could have spent more time thinking and talking as a technical and policy community about how we don't just default to government regulation. So I'm going to talk about a couple of opportunities, analogies here around standards development. So we see opportunities for, especially around communications. One of the reasons I'm here talking with IPNSIG today is because you're thinking about this all the time. Navigation and power, but also shared infrastructure. So the International Space System has the International Space Station has a space power system interoperability standard, which means that components are built in different countries, but that the power standard is a shared power standard for that entire station. And that's quite a unique thing. That power standard was developed specifically for the ISS across competing nations, working collaboratively to develop shared infrastructure. And that standards development process and how it was applied and used in the context of the ISS is something that Open Lunar believes can be used as a precedent and applied in the lunar context. And I think it's also an example for us to think about how we could engage the management of those standard systems through a multi-stakeholder model. I love the example of the CubeSat standard. So the second picture here is not an original CubeSat, it's just a CubeSat. But the standard was proposed by Jordy and Bob out of Stanford University in 1999, so a long time ago. And they didn't intend it as a standard. They just published a design specification for a small satellite. And at the time, it was unheard of to build a small satellite. So the satellites were large. They were the size of cars or buses, and they were large, complex, millions or billions of dollars projects. And these two gentlemen understood that the state of the art was such that it would be possible to build and design a much smaller, cheaper satellite. And through a process of emergence, essentially this standard or this plan for a CubeSat eventually became a standard because it was adopted and used and tweaked and developed by so many people working around it, seeing the larger opportunity for a new kind of infrastructure that could service and support so many things, including imagery, communications that are now sort of, I think, essentially catalyzed the new space sector is this design. And so how many more of these exist? Open Lunar believes many more CubeSat standards exist and just haven't been discovered or developed yet. And so we're in the business of thinking about what's the next CubeSat standard? What is the next CubeSat standard for the moon? I also want to talk about an initiative, the Logic Initiative, which was recently established by DARPA, I think just late last year, which operates on a model that's very close to the multi-stakeholder model, in that it's bringing a bunch of different stakeholders together to discuss standards development in relation to lunar operating procedures. Now, it's mostly, though I don't think entirely US-based, and I don't know that they follow norms and conventions associated with the multi-stakeholder model. For example, just pulling out the idea of rough consensus in the IETF or BOF sessions, or methods that are used to generate consensus around technical standards in those forums. So it would be amazing, to my mind, to have someone from, for example, the IETF board of directors on the Logic team to help them think about how standards development could be advocated or be made more efficient based on lessons learned from the creation of commercial internet infrastructure. And I just think there's such a wealth of knowledge that could be shared there that would accelerate that work. And, DARPA did play some role in the creation of the internet. I'm being a bit cheeky there, assuming most people know that it was a pretty big role. So I also wanted to talk not just about like the big things that we know about. Everyone sort of goes to, not everyone, but a lot of people go to ICANN when they think about technical internet governance, because it's, showy and it runs the top level domains and the country code top level domains. But what's really fascinating for me about the internet ecosystem is these other organizations that toil in relative obscurity and yet make a tremendous contribution to the seamlessness and the reliability that the global internet users experience today. So for example, the Network Startup Resource Center is a small nonprofit based out of University of Portland that goes around the world helping country code top-level domain operators and many other type of infrastructure operators, trains them, gives them access to open source equipment, helps them run their infrastructure, teaches them about the norms, the cultural norms, about how you kind of get CCTLDs and internet infrastructure right, starts to socialize the process of building internet infrastructure on a national level. I had the honor of participating in a couple of their workshops in the Caribbean, and it's incredible what they can do with so little resources. This was a long time ago, mine. It was 20 years ago. But, parachuting in, training a bunch of people, empowering them to take ownership over their infrastructure and getting out. And that type of can-do attitude and that commitment, not just to the technical aspects of the internet, but the cultural exchange associated with becoming a technical internet expert and the norms of interaction, is really incredible. And it doesn't really exist at scale in the space sector, to my knowledge, although I'm happy to be corrected wrong. Packet Clearinghouse, again, just an example of internet exchange points. The idea that through peering, through co-locating infrastructure, we can reduce costs, compete on services and not infrastructure. The whole notion of this and the fact that it's a nonprofit are, I think, just tremendous examples that could be drawn into space. And I think to myself, what are the nonprofit communication services that could be delivered in the lunar context? Could we have an open communications relay at a Lagrange point, for example? And what would that look like for accelerating lunar infrastructure development? I've talked a little bit about the IETF, and what I love and always praise about the IETF is the way that it makes decisions, the adherence to rough consensus and running code, the idea of BOF sessions, the notion of humming consensus, the idea that the idea even of the name of a request for comment. The policy is never finished. It's always an evolving process. That kind of dynamism is so critical to fast-moving technical environments. And we have so much I think the space sector has so much to learn from that way of working. And the IETF is only possible as an institution because of the contributions of the Public Interest Registry. And I'm sure that the IETF would continue without PIR, but it was enabled and supported because of far-sighted decisions that were made by individuals to say, not only do we care about the culture of the internet, but we're going to support it with capital. That's a really big decision because it doesn't happen in a lot of other sectors. I have not seen such a, let's say, a far-sighted and cogent commitment to supporting underlying infrastructure in, for example, the sustainability and environment sector. So I still work and advise people who work in ESG and people who work in climate data, for example. There is no equivalent of the IETF or PIR supporting the development of national and international standards around climate data. And it's a big problem. We have a huge rat's nest of standards which are holding up our ability to manage and report and reduce our climate emissions because we don't have effective standardization yet. And again, there's a lot that we can learn from technical internet governance about how to get that right. And some of it comes down to these really far-sighted decisions from these groups. And so I think a lot about what could we do now in the lunar context so that the scenario 30, 50 years from now is more of an internet scenario on the moon, as opposed to this sort of climate standard scenario on the moon, where we have this patchwork quilt and a failure to interoperate. So I've done a lot of MSM boosting, but I am going to say that, not all things are perfect. Every toad has warts. And there are sort of things that don't work or aren't quite working or are challenges that we need to be cognizant and aware of. One of the things that I see a lot is these sort of almost but not quite multi-stakeholder models, where you have something that looks super multi-stakeholder and it has companies and it has governments and it has civil society and technical experts. But then when you look at like how the decisions are actually made, it's still governments. Governments have the final say, right? Or it's still the private sector that just has like the veto power. And so we've got to be really careful when we talk about multi-stakeholder models to hold true to the notion that that the consensus has to be between these stakeholder groups. If you just have one stakeholder group consulting, that's not really a multi-stakeholder model in my view. It's kind of like a multi-stakeholder consultation. And I do think that that comes with costs. It comes with costs in terms of how people choose to engage and interact. And it comes with costs in terms of the quality of policy that is output at the end. This is a term I just made up, and feel free to laugh at me, cliquification of MSM models. So, I have friends who are closely involved with ICANN and with IETF, and one of the challenges that is just a reality in all forums, and not just in these forums, so I don't want to pick on them specifically, but it is a challenge, is that you get people who contribute for years and years and years, and you get a language that builds up, and you get a familiarity that builds up. And as a result of that, it becomes really hard to break in. And then you get this kind of calcification that happens where the opinions start to get maybe a little less relevant, or You're not listening like the way that you used to, and then the policy outcomes start to erode in terms of their agility and relevance. And it can be really hard to see that when you're inside that model, working hard on it. But you can get pushback from the outside world. And when I advocate for multi-stakeholder models in other forums, this is one of the primary kind of pushbacks that I get from their adoption, is that, you know, you're just kind of enabling a clique, and that creates another kind of monopoly. So these are things that can be addressed, and there's lots of tools for addressing, stable renewal of governance models over time. It's just important to think about, how do we be farsighted about that change and transition of expertise and openness to new ideas over time. So we think about how do we, when I think about applying a lunar MSM, I think a lot about that. Also thinking about imbalances due to existing inequalities. So one of the challenges that ICANN has experienced, for example, is, and I'll give a specific example here, in the registry stakeholder group, the decision-making power for the registry stakeholder group for generic top-level domains is rated by domains under management. So there's one company that has a lot of domains under management, it's the .com registry, and they effectively, as a result of the constitution that's put in place for that group, control it. And again, getting back up to my point one, almost but not quite multi-stakeholder, I would hesitate to call the registry stakeholder group, you know, fully a multi-stakeholder organization. I mean, it is designed to just represent registries, but its decision-making power is skewed in such a way that it becomes really difficult to say, is that really an opinion of the community? And if you can't be sure of that, how can you be sure that the policy outcomes are effective solutions for the entire community and not just for a subset of that community? So that's something that's really important to I think about when you're designing new multi-stakeholder models or thinking about applying existing multi-stakeholder models to new sectors. So I'll just talk a little bit about lunar MSMs in Open Lunar's research. So you can see here what we've done is taken the registry concept and we've leveraged it to drive transparency and collaboration. So you think about our domain name registry at a country code level, unique identifiers provide a resource for machines and for people to ensure the unique resolvability of domain names. That also works at the IANA level, where you have an authoritative list of domain endings. So our team thought of this, and not just me, the experts that we work with thought of this idea of having a lunar registry of missions, objects, and activities. And we're doing this in two applications. One is object and activities, but the other is thinking about incident reporting, so incidents and accidents, and how we can get missions to share information about what works and what doesn't. The neat thing about registries like this is that they provide a neutral, independent source of information, so they create transparency, but also on top of them, you can layer a multi-stakeholder model. So lots of registries use multi-stakeholder models or approximations of them, particularly country codes. And so there's a well-trodden path for how you build an MSM on top of a registry. So it is a way for us to insert and pioneer this new type of governance. And we also just don't have this. We do not have, as a species, a single authoritative place where anyone can go and look at who is planning to go to the moon, what's happening on the moon, what happened on the moon in the past, what are the devices up there, how broad of an area will they impact, what is their intended mission, duration, orbit path, all these different things. So we're really excited to be working on this project and actively looking for partners to support us on it. This is another example of shared infrastructure. So lunar landing pads are a really important piece of lunar infrastructure because of lunar dust. So we still really don't have an excellent understanding of how dust lofting is going to impact lunar exploration. So as something lands on the moon, it's going to kick up dust. Lunar dust is a very sharp, sort of shard-like thing because there's no erosion on the moon. We don't know how far it's going to go. We don't know how long it's going to stay up in the atmosphere. And so we think that, and if it gets into machinery and particularly into human infrastructure like spacesuits, it can be really challenging to work with. So landing pads to reduce that risk are really important. But you can imagine having a bunch of landing pads in a small area, for example, around the South Pole, and conflicts around lunar, siting, optimal siting of landing pads, people landing on other people's landing pads, et cetera, et cetera. So we're exploring a model for a collaborative approach to lunar landing pads. So I think drawing on this idea of internet exchange points, what can we do to collaborate on infrastructure and compete on services? And could we study the business models of internet exchange points or other collaborative types of infrastructure and apply that to pioneer a business model for creating cooperative lunar landing pads? This last one is one that's sort of near and dear to my heart. You'll have seen in the news recently. You may have seen in the news recently, I think just yesterday, the White House announced a lunar time zone. So their intention is to create a time zone for the moon. And might be thinking, why does the moon need its own time zone? Well, in particular, it needs a time zone that is accurate to the moon for communications and navigation. So timing is a really important component of navigation. You're sending a signal and you're measuring the time it takes for that signal to bounce off a reference point. And the time goes out, the signal goes out, comes back. The time allows you to calculate the distance traveled. Even very small problems with inaccuracies in that time can result in huge distance miscalculations. And it's a big problem that lots of people are working to solve it. One of the ways that we're thinking about it is how can we do it in an open source way? So this is a Facebook time card. It is a completely open source time card that was developed to make accessible the benefits of timing in the internet communications context. And forgive me, I'm not a deep expert on this, so I'm going to make a hash of it, but I'm going to do my best to summarize the work of the experts that we've engaged to do this. Our team, and notably, I'm going to call out Phil Linden and Ashley Kozak, who are recent fellows of us, have been thinking about bringing the designers of this card together, as well as other timing experts, to think about how we could build something that's space ready. So how could we do an open source timing solution that could be space ready and potentially put it into low Earth orbit or lunar orbit, and actually get lots of these in place so that they could aggregate a signal up from each other to create an algorithm that would be an accurate timing signal that's crowdsourced, as opposed to a really expensive atomic clock. The NASA, I think, recently flew the DSAC, an atomic clock, into space, and we're talking about huge amounts of money to put something like that on the moon or even in space. And so if there's a low cost consumer off-the-shelf solution for us to make an open timing signal for navigation in the lunar context, wouldn't that be incredible for everyone who was, even if they're just using it as a fallback signal? It creates a resilient infrastructure layer that's open, and it brings the best of what we understand from how technology works efficiently here on Earth into that lunar context. So I'll stop talking there. I hope I haven't prattled on for too long. There's a couple ways you can get involved with our work. Join our Slack community. So you can go to openlunar.org and you can apply to join our Slack community. It's an informal group. We're looking for technical subject matter experts, not just in the lunar space, but also in other spaces, to help us kind of think differently about how we do our work. You can apply to become an affiliate, which is a subject matter expert. Affiliates are people who volunteer a couple hours a month of their time, and they're the ones responsible for helping us curate our idea set and choose our fellowships, as well as evaluate the effectiveness of our ongoing research projects. If you have research ideas, things that you think we should work on, true to our philosophy of being open, we're open to ideas. So please propose those, and they will be reviewed by our team. And of course, if you're an institution, we're always interested in mission-aligned institutional partnerships. We're very informal in the way that we approach partnerships. We like to align around our values, so peaceful and sustainable lunar future, and a commitment to STEM, to integrating interdisciplinary STEM and policy discussions, particularly in a lunar context. And yeah, just thank you very much for the opportunity to present here, and I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. Really interesting talk, Jacob. And we've got, I think, a couple of questions stacked up here. One is from Philip Linden, and his question is has to do with utilities. It says lunar utilities, power, communications, are mission critical for every lunar actor, but are still privately owned. Does policymaking cover the situation where multiple private actors control the lifeline of others? Do we need new economic tools as well to make multi-stakeholder utilities viable? How do we have multi-stakeholder responsible shared utility providers in a lunar context?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. What I would say is that there is a great cultural, a really important cultural lesson coming from internet governance, where the companies understand the value of collaboration around infrastructure, and I'm always amazed at the number of engineers from Cisco or Google that are able to go to, or Microsoft, that go to ICANN meetings, that make time because they understand the value set that drives the effectiveness of the internet. And I think it really comes down to values, and how do we inculcate a value of collaboration in the context of space infrastructure, drawing on established lessons. And I think examples are part of the way that we do that, but also cultural exchange between those people.
Okay, very helpful. Just a comment that was raised in the chat is that the concept of shared landing and launching pads on the moon has some elements of analogy with airports on Earth. Have you looked at it in that context at all, and used airport organization as a possible model for operation of shared landing pads?
I think that's a great insight. And our lead researcher for that, Ashley Kozak, is doing that investigation, both looking at business model analogs presently, but also what's happening in the lunar context. So I will convey that to her as a potential opportunity for exploration.
Great, thanks. And a somewhat irreverent question. Do you happen to have watched the TV series For All Mankind?
Yeah, I watched it up to season 3.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you had any had drawn any reactions, or if drawn any ideas or inspiration from the evolution of events in first couple seasons of that show.
Yeah, I think there's a really important episode where the sort of I guess the Russian communist cosmonaut and the American astronaut meet, and they kind of have to decide how they're going to treat each other. And it really underlines the tension and the importance of things like diplomacy and communication and interaction before you get to that point, right? I mean, I think for the drama of the show, it's intense to see these people at this place on the lunar surface. But I would say in our real lived experience, we still have Russian cosmonauts going up to the ISS. And I prefer the example of the ISS, that even people who are adversarial can find ways to collaborate when it comes to space. And I really hope that that attitude prevails, because space is incredibly risky. It's incredibly dangerous. People keep telling me space is hard, and it's harder when you don't get along. So let's use that as an example to come together and not to pull each other apart.
I think it's a good way of looking at it. I have one other question, which is the multi-stakeholder models operating on a consensus basis seems like and clearly is a terrific model. It works very well, for example, in the internet and ITF. Is everything that we're doing right now strictly advisory and consensual, or do you foresee the development of any sort of an enforcement machinery in the foreseeable future?
Are you referring to particularly internet governance models, or?
Norms of behavior, norms of conduct.
Hmm.
Is there a potential for establishing something that would make us less reliant on the goodwill of everyone who's participating?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think this tension has certainly existed since I started working on this area. One of the first roles that I had at ICANN was to go to the World Summit on the Information Society in Tunisia, and I was exposed quite directly to the potential for ITU regulation of the internet. The potential for UN regulation of the internet at the time was on the table. And what I would say is that we need to be careful to fall into either or traps with large, complex infrastructure projects. And I would hate to, I think this idea that, there's only one way to govern space and there's only one way to govern the internet misses the point. There are elements of internet governance that may require regulation. And there are elements of internet governance that would suffer greatly if they were regulated. And so I still think that the way forward is where possible to hew to one of the things that I love so much about internet governance, which is that the primacy of the expert, the person who actually knows what they're doing, the scientist, the technical engineer, they need to be listened to and heard and understood by policymakers. And we risk making decisions that are damaging to infrastructure if we don't create space for those people to flourish.
I have 3 more questions if we've got time. I think there's a couple of minutes. One is, what do you see as the difference between governance and standardization? Are there areas that might require standardization but not governance, and vice versa?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Boy, I'm just going to lean back and think about that for a second. So I could be wrong about this, but I think about standardization mostly in a technical sense. So what is the port, that is going to be used for power, or what is the particular nature of an object? Can it be standardized so that it could be replaced easily on the on the moon, for example, allowing for a circular economy type of approach? Governance to me is a more broadly encompassing term that does include standards, but might also include norms of behavior, right? And ways of working and acting that reduce risk, for example, reduce risk of conflict, or result in the creation of effective and efficient standards. So it's somewhat separate, and I think that they are complementary, and they must always be thought of together in some fashion for you to have an effective regime.
So I think a closer related question is, can you think of what would distinguish something that needs formal governance from something that is informal coordination is sufficient? Is there a red line?
Well, that's another great question. I would love to debate this at length with other people who are more expert than I on this topic. Yeah, I would say that one thing that comes to mind for me, for example, is safety standards, right? So there's not a lot of the nature of safety standards is that they are designed to protect life and limb. And in that way, having some form of overarching authority to ensure the quality and control around those standards is important because they're confidence building in a particular way. Even so, though, however, I would say that there is an opportunity to think about safety standards in the context of engaging different stakeholder groups effectively. There's just a question of the need for an additional layer there. And I think sometimes we actually even think that, I think we're not as creative as we could be as a species about how deeply and broadly we could deploy these models to make them efficient and effective. Because we can assume sometimes that the government model or a single stakeholder model to sign off on the security and stability of something is like the best way to do it and the most effective way to assure that it's properly done. But yet, regulatory capture is a thing. You know, I could reference the BP oil spill that happened in the Gulf. It was a regulator that approved that. So we know that there are examples of these systems not being effective, even in cases that are extremely risky.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for just one more question, which is a somewhat more specific question and aimed in particular at the delay tolerant networking, interplanetary networking domain. Do you have any views on the governance of interconnection resources, such as, for example, things like bundled protocol node numbers or service numbers, the other kinds of things that are standards in operating the communication protocols for the space internet?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I'm not an engineer, first of all, so I want to be careful about getting too far out over my skis. But I have read and talked to a number of people about DTN bundle protocol. I think what I would look, I do have an opinion about this, but I'm aware that I'm not an expert in the field, and want to be careful about opining on things that I'm not an expert on. So I think I'll pass on that question, but I am open to having an informal discussion with any experts about it, because I do have some views, and I feel like there are risks of compromise between bundle protocol and like openness that I would love to debate more. And I'm also interested in like whether IP can just work in the lunar context. I know it won't work in the Martian context, but there are people that I've talked to that says, well, we can just use IP on the moon, and we don't need DTN. So I don't know if that's true, but it's something I'm really interested in learning more and understanding and exploring how that works. And I'm also interested in like how DTN impacts the multi-stakeholder model and vice versa, because of the different ways in which it's developed, particularly that it has to be stored for a period, I think, sometimes, and then pulled together again.
I think these would be really productive conversations to have, and I hope we're able to stand some of those up after we conclude today. I'm very interested in getting your thoughts on this and exchanging some views. And with that, I think we're done. Yeah, okay. No more open questions. I will once again thank you, Jacob, for a very illuminating and insightful conversation. And I will bring up a couple of terminal slides now. Hang on. Let's see if I can do this in a way that makes sense. Well, wait a minute. Let me try again. Shit. And bring this out. This image. Okay, and I'm hoping that makes some sense. So at this point, we're sort of done. We would first of all, I'll invite everyone watching to view past and upcoming IPNSIG Academy Keynote presentations, and this is the website to go to for that. If you have questions, please feel free to send email to the secretariat at IPNSIG.org. Good. IPNSIG.org is a, I think 401c3. It's a nonprofit organization. We don't make any money. We spend some. So if it is in your capability to send some money to IPNSIG to help us continue this work, please do. We now have a donation facility set up on the website. Here is a QR code to use for making a most welcome donation. If you text IPNSIG to 55-555, then that will be another way that you can donate much needed funds to the operation of the Internet chapter of the Internet Society, Interplanetary chapter of the Internet Society. You are most welcome to become a member of IPNSIG if you're not already a member. The IPNSIG is an Internet chapter that is interplanetary in scope, which means that all of the various parts of Earth are inside the scope of the IPNSIG. So no matter what part of the globe you're connecting from, you're welcome to join us. There's participation from all over the place. We have over 1,000 members at this point. If you're interested in joining the chapter, send a message, please, to membership@IPNSIG.org, and we'll be glad to get you signed up. And that is the conclusion of our Academy presentation for today. Thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the universe.